Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the second album from Tiësto, Just Be. Okay, so In My Memory was probably the most respectable thing that Tiësto ever put out. From there, his music would get progressively cheesier and poppier, and some people would occasionally be turned off by what he was doing. I don't think Just Be in particular is poppier than his debut, but it is probably cheesier. The grooves on this one were a lot more bombastic and over the top. There were quite a few tracks that had like classical inspired chord progressions, or in one case just an outright trance cover of a classical piece. It's also the project where Tiësto first brought on DJ Wonky, who co-produced everything on this project, as well as the vast majority of his next two albums. How much of the workload Regiers handled, I'm not totally sure. I've been told before that this is mostly Regiers' work, with Tiësto himself basically just being a face to plaster on the album cover. Though given this stuff is so stylistically similar to In My Memory, I'm willing to believe there was still, actual collaboration going on here. And even if that's not the case, I still have to say on record that Just Be is my personal favorite Tiësto album overall. It's still not a great album to me. It's got its flaws and lower points. It's certainly not the most impressively produced trance music I've ever heard. And if you told me that this was too cheesy and commercial for you, I'd be like, yeah, I get you. But nah, this is just some all-around solid trance music if you ask me. The 10 tracks on here all have a defined identity and at least give me something to enjoy. It's certainly not a short listen, it runs on a good 78 minutes. But I'm mostly kept interested the whole time. There's just enough variety and the hard-hitting trance grooves are consistently satisfying enough to justify that meaty length. Pretty much every track on here has the potential to be a favorite track on here. With the exception of one, which I may as well just go into that one first and get it out of the way. I'm not much of a fan of the 6th track here, You Are, featuring Aqualung, and co-written by these people. I get the feeling it's trying to be this project's equivalent to Battleship Grey, like be this kind of airy trip-hop-ish cut to break things up. But first of all, it's not one we need quite as much, especially when there's already another better trip-hop-ish ballad in here in Sweet Misery. And You Are is not as good as either that, and especially not Battleship Grey. Aqualung is a decent singer, I guess, but I'm not particularly invested in his performance, and his marginally yelpy presence makes this track feel weirdly out of place among all these super polished trance productions. Not sure if his appearance is better or worse than his appearance on BT's Surrounded. He didn't feel as openly out of place on A Song Across Wires, though that track was also probably the least interesting moment on that album too. But I don't know. You Are, it's an okay enough track. It's certainly not terrible or anything, but it did consistently stick out to me as my least favorite on here. It's the only one that I ever feel compelled to skip entirely. But the rest of this album's really solid. Going down the rest of the individual tracks, we start with Forever Today, which feels like it mirrors the opener of In My Memory pretty well, even as the same co-writer as Magic Journey, that guy, as well as Daniel Stewart. But yeah, Forever Today blows Magic Journey out of the water. Magic Journey shrunk on me with more repeat listens and ended up with me feeling less compelled to come back to it the more I heard it. But Forever Today was great when I first heard it and remained great with every revisit. It's probably the best track on the whole album. Clocking in at almost exactly 12 minutes, it's got this nice big orchestral intro that has quite a lot of dynamic range, some very quiet parts and swelling into louder parts. I may feel compelled to adjust the volume quite a bit there. And for whatever reason, that intro's in a different key from the main bulk of the track. It's totally disconnected from what comes afterwards, aside from having the same chord progression, I think. But once the track does get going, it's freaking awesome, has tons of propulsive grooves and that sort of classical flair in the chord progression. It gives it some extra drama and weight. Tiësto really starting out with his best foot forward. And then there's the track featuring none other than BT himself, Love Comes Again. The existence of Electronic Opus made this one stick with me way more than it probably would have otherwise. I remember back when he still had that Kickstarter running and I was impatiently waiting to be able to hear that project. Knowing this track would be on there was what initially convinced me to go through Tiësto's back catalog for the first time. The Electronic Opus version is in fact an improvement on the original, still one of the best moments on there, but the original still holds up too. hard-hitting. BT's vocal performance is fun, even if he sometimes pronounces words weird, like peripheral vision. Also introduces those bombastic sawtooth leads that I so frequently associate with Tiësto's peak period, even though that's actually probably Rogier's, given how said leads weren't really on in my memory as much. There are moments in the back half of the track where if said leads play like half the rhythm they were playing before, and it's kind of awkward, but yeah, never mind that. Love Comes Again kicks ass, it's another big personal favorite. Then we got Traffic, the most straightforward trance cut here, focusing on the darker industrial side of the Tiësto sound. This one's not a huge favorite, admittedly. It felt kind of basic to me in comparison with other moments on here, but I certainly wouldn't want it removed entirely. It's still fun and hard-hitting, as always. Sweet Misery, meanwhile, takes the tempo down, and we get our more down-tempo ballad moment with vocals from Joanne Lloyd, who weirdly does not get a proper featuring credit, as well as being co-written by these two people. It's pretty nice, emotional stuff, good tune that combines the airy trip-hop sound with the usual Tiësto hard-hitting industrial tinged grooves. Not really much else to note about it, but it is one that pretty frequently sticks out as a favorite. Nyana is another sorta classical tinged cut. It may not be as great as Forever Today, but it still hits hard, has its soaring moments, nice satisfying chord progression, nothing to complain about there. Then after You Are, which I already talked about, we get the first of two tracks featuring Kirsty Hawkshaw again. And perhaps unsurprisingly, both of these tracks are big favorites of mine. Hawkshaw delivers as great a performance as she always does on both of these. Walking on Clouds, co-written by Josh Gabriel, is the better produced of the two. Certainly seems to live up to its title in the way it absolutely soars. Though the other one, the title track, Just Be, probably has the catchier tune. Co-written by James Wiltshire and Judy Tsuke, the latter being the original writer of BT's Dreaming, fun fact there. And while I'm on the topic of the title track here, I'll admit I kinda have a bias away from this particular version of the track, as I first heard it as a solo Kirsty Hawkshaw track called Just Be Me, which kinda repurposed the track as like an airier, down-tempo pop song, sort of, that I think conveys the emotion of her performance a lot better than Tiësto's way louder and more percussive take on the tune. This version almost sometimes ends up feeling kinda off as a result with all its stabbing synth tones. But you know, this version still got its own appeal and is really nice to have around either way. It's one of my favorites here. I'm certainly not going to complain about an album having more Kirsty Hawkshaw. Anyway, in between the two Hawkshaw cuts is A Tear in the Open, another sort of classical tinge track maybe, with the same production team as Forever Today. And no, it's not as good as that track either, but it is still pretty good. Has another vocal performance in another language I don't recognize. I'm told it's a sample from Spectrasonic's Vocal Planet, and the actual singer is not credited anywhere, but whatever. The track's not a massive standout, but once again I never feel the urge to skip it either. I go back and forth on whether or not I like this one more than Nyana. This one's a little more disjointed, but it probably does hit harder. But that leaves us with the closer, a trance cover of Samuel Barber's Adagio for Strings. And I got mixed feelings on this one. Now, first of all, no, Tiësto is not the first one to this idea. William Orbit did a synth remake of the composition several years prior on his Pieces in a Modern Style album, though his version didn't really do much of anything outside of just playing the original composition on synth pads instead of strings. It was a pretty dull take on the piece, even if I remember quite liking the rest of that album. The Tiësto version, if nothing else, is definitely not boring. However, it's also probably the single most ridiculous and silly thing on the whole album. Unlike other tracks here, which just have some minor classical influence and are pretty tasteful in comparison, the Adagio for Strings cover comes off more like a silly novelty and a gimmick. It's significantly more over the top than most of the other tracks here. It's got parts that get intense to the point of even clipping the mix. Not to mention, one of the main driving synth riffs forms a perfect fourth with the root key of the track, and never changes from that note. I mean, it doesn't form like a sour interval or anything, but it does feel like disconnected from the rest of the groove and out of place. It feels kind of off-putting as a result. But even so, as ridiculous as this track is, I cannot hate on it. It doesn't feel like Tiësto or Rogier's have any sense of self-awareness on how cheesy they sound and are just going totally all the way with the idea and not holding back. I kinda gotta respect it for how shameless it is and how cool it thinks it is. And the intensity and balls-to-the-wall nature of the track does feel like an all-around satisfying way to close this project. I still quite like it. But yeah, that's just B. Obviously don't think this album is incredible or anything. It's got its underwhelming moments and ridiculous moments and ideas that don't quite work. But it is my overall favorite project from Tiësto, as I said. It's the one that has the most tracks that just stick out in my mind as highlights. Whenever I think of Tiësto's peak period, I'm immediately going to be thinking of tracks from this album in particular. I'll be thinking of Forever Today and Love Comes Again and the title track and even Adagio for Strings. Again, if you think it's nothing but a big ball of cheese, I mean, you wouldn't be wrong. But it's a ball of cheese that I still like coming back to every now and then. Cheesy or not, Just Be is just a solid collection of trance music with lots of memorable tracks that have always stuck with me, and I can't hate on any of it. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10. But of course, it's just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.